Every nation on earth is drowning in debt. The United States, $38 trillion. Japan, $9 trillion. Global total, $315 trillion. More than 3 times the entire world economy. Yet here's the puzzle that should keep you awake at night. If everyone is in debt, then who is the creditor? Who is the world actually paying? Follow that question far enough, and the floor beneath finance collapses into a paradox. The world owes money, to itself. Not to a king. Not to a single empire. Not to some shadowy billionaire with a golden vault. The system is structured so that debt itself becomes the product. But this design, this global financial loop you can never escape, didn't appear by accident. It was built. Stone by stone. Century after century. By 4 men, 4 financial engineers, each living in a different era. Yet constructing the same machine. A world where debt can never be fully repaid. Governments borrow endlessly. Interest flows upward like a constant tribute. And every crisis creates new profit for the architects. No conspiracy, no hidden files in dusty basements. The agreements were public. The meetings documented. The mechanisms still used today. This is not a story about corruption. It is a story about architecture. A grand financial cathedral built over 331 years. And every one of us lives inside it. The first pillar, William Patterson and the birth of forever debt. Before the year 1694, kings borrowed money the old, medieval way. A crown asks a noble for gold. The noble demands repayment with interest. Either the king repays, or he defaults and the noble takes the loss. The outcomes were final. Debt had an ending. Until a Scottish merchant named William Paterson offered a deal that would rewrite the DNA of money itself. England was bleeding cash. War with France was draining the treasury. Traditional lenders refused to help, England had defaulted before. Patterson walked into King William III's court with an idea so radical. It should have been laughed out of the kingdom. Instead, it was embraced. He proposed that wealthy merchants lend the crown. £1.2 million is almost equal to $300 million today. But here was the revolutionary twist. The loan would never be repaid. England would pay interest, forever. No principal. No finish line. Just a permanent river of taxes flowing to creditors. To handle this immortal loan, Patterson suggested a new institution. The Bank of England. The structure was breathtakingly simple. Keycap 1, the merchants deposited gold into the bank. Keycap 2, the bank loaned that gold to the government. Keycap 3, Parliament taxed citizens to pay 8% interest every year. Keycap 4, the bank passed the interest back to the merchants. Keycap 5, the principal remained untouched. It was a financial perpetual motion machine. The merchants received interest-paying banknotes in exchange. And these notes could be traded, making them even more valuable than gold. Money, for the first time, was created from government debt. Why this mattered? Patterson unlocked a formula that remains the backbone of the global economy. Debt equals money. The more the state borrowed, the more money existed. He turned national debt into a feature, not a problem. Taxpayers became the engine. Bankers collected interest. Debt became permanent. Parliament approved the plan. The first brick of the debt trap was laid. A system that outlived its creator. Patterson didn't die rich. But what he built still rules the British economy 331 years later. The United Kingdom has never paid off its national debt. It has only refinanced, rolling the burden forward to new generations. This wasn't a flaw. It was the design. If your bank collects interest forever, why would you ever want the debt to end? The second pillar, the Rothschild web. By the early 1800s, countries were addicted to borrowing. Wars and empires demanded endless funding. But lending was chaotic. Rates varied, markets were local, risk was high. Until one banking family industrialized sovereign debt. Like a mass production factory. The Rothschilds. 5 brothers. 5 cities. One unparalleled network. London. Paris. Frankfurt. Vienna. Naples. Messages, gold, political secrets. They traveled faster through Rothschild couriers than through any government channel. Nathan Rothschild, in London, understood the game better than anyone else. He didn't just lend to governments. He bought government bonds. Cheap. And resold them to investors expensive. He built the secondary market. Where debt becomes a commodity, traded like sugar or steel. The government gets money. Investors get a safer asset. And the Rothschilds pocket the profit in between. But that wasn't the true genius. The true power came from information. Waterloo, the day information became money. In 1815, Nathan Rothschild learned the result of Waterloo. Before the British government did. Napoleon had been defeated. But London didn't know. Not yet. Rothschild sold everything publicly. Everyone assumed Britain had lost. Panic spread. Prices collapsed. Then he quietly bought all the bonds he could. The next day. Victory confirmed. Market soared. Rothschild's fortune multiplied. Not illegal. Not luck. Control. The trap closes. Rothschild transformed debt from a transaction between 2 parties. Down arrow. Into an interconnected global web. Defaulting wasn't simply refusing a creditor anymore. It risked global financial collapse. Governments became trapped. They had to keep paying. And, crucially, they had to keep borrowing. Debt stopped being a burden. It became the blood of the entire economic system. The rich didn't need to own land anymore. They owned the governments that taxed the land. The pattern becomes clear. Patterson made debt eternal. Rothschild made it international. 2 architects done. 2 more to come. But already the world had crossed a line. Debt was no longer a temporary solution. It was the operating system of civilization itself. The machine was waking up. And it would never sleep again. By the turn of the 20th century, the United States was rising like an industrial supernova. Steel, railroads, oil, a booming population. Yet America still had a primitive financial bloodstream. No central authority to stabilize the economy. Banks acting independently like disconnected organs. Money tied to gold, limiting growth. Panics erupting every decade. The country was powerful on the surface. But fragile underneath. And whenever the cracks appeared, one name stepped in. J. P. Morgan. The private banker who acted like America's unofficial king of finance. The banker's coup in 1907. A crisis hit. Banks failed. The stock market collapsed. Lines formed outside shuttered vaults. Ordinary citizens desperate to withdraw their life savings. With no central bank to stop the contagion. The entire system teetered. Morgan intervened personally. He summoned the heads of New York's major banks to his private library. He locked the doors. No one left. Until they agreed to collectively bail out the failing financial institutions. It worked. Confidence returned. Markets stabilized. One man had saved American capitalism. But Morgan was aging. He knew the system couldn't rely On one mortal banker. He needed a government-backed institution that played by Wall Street's rules. So the next step of the trap was engineered. In the shadows. Jekyll Island, the blueprint for a new power. In 1910, a covert group of bankers and politicians boarded a private train and vanished southward to Jekyll Island, Georgia. No reporters. No public knowledge. No transparency. Their mission: design a central bank that looked democratic, but served the banks. The group included Senator Nelson Aldrich and representatives of the largest New York banks, all allies of Morgan. For 9 days, they drafted the blueprint for America's new monetary regime. It wouldn't be called a central bank. It would be a system. It would appear regional, public, independent. But its levers of power would be controlled by the bankers themselves. The public would think the government was in charge. But the New York Federal Reserve, the crown jewel of the system, would be steered by Wall Street hands. This wasn't a compromise. It was camouflage. 1913, the Federal Reserve is born. Congress approved the Federal Reserve Act just before Christmas, when most lawmakers were absent, and few understood the implications. Suddenly, the U.S. government could borrow without limit. The Fed could create money from government debt. Wall Street had a built-in customer for U.S. bonds. The bankers received a guaranteed interest stream funded by taxpayers. A new era began. Debt no longer depended on investor appetite or bank reserves. Now the government could expand debt indefinitely, because the Federal Reserve would always buy more. This is the moment. Debt stopped having a ceiling. Patterson made debt permanent. Rothschild made debt global. Morgan made debt infinite. And the U.S. was now the empire upon which the system would rise. Interest becomes a tax by another name. After 1913, the U.S. debt transformed from a periodic obligation into a permanent business model. Taxpayers do the labor. Banks collect the rent. Every year, interest must be paid just to maintain the status quo. And none of it touches the principal. You don't pay for government spending. That's a myth. You pay to keep the machine alive. The fourth architect, the age of Vulkar. By the 1970s, the machine was running globally. Europe, Japan, North America. All locked into perpetual borrowing. But the developing world was the machine's weak link. They had borrowed billions for highways, power plants, modernization. But as interest payments grew, many couldn't keep up. Until a man named Paul Volcker made escape impossible. 1979, the interest rate shock. Volcker, chairman of the Federal Reserve, confronted a new monster. Inflation soaring above 10%. The dollar's credibility, the backbone of global finance, was cracking. Volcker lifted interest rates to 20%, the highest in American history. Inflation broke. The U.S. economy fell into recession. But the real earthquake shook the developing world. Mexico owed $80 billion. Brazil $60 billion. Argentina $40 billion. When interest rates tripled, their debts became unpayable. They stood on the edge of default. A sane system would have allowed it. Let the debt clear. Start fresh. Reset the board. But that would have threatened the banks who held the debt. Massive losses. Bankruptcies. Collapse. So Vulkar deployed the final mechanism of control. The IMF, help that hurts. Instead of allowing a reset, the International Monetary Fund stepped in. Loans were granted. Not to rebuild, but to keep interest payments flowing. These were called structural adjustment loans. The conditions were ruthless. Government spending slashed. State assets privatized. Currency devalued. Borders opened to foreign capital. Social programs gutted. These nations didn't receive assistance. They surrendered economic sovereignty in exchange for staying in debt. And they never escaped. Their debts were not forgiven. Only restructured. Extended. Embedded deeper. Into their national lifeblood. Volcker ensured that once a country entered the system, it would never leave. The Patterson trap made debt endless. The Rothschild web made default catastrophic. The Morgan mechanism made borrowing limitless. The Vulkar doctrine made escape forbidden. For architects. For centuries. One destiny. The modern picture, a world built on IOUs. Look around today. Government debt. Corporate debt. Household debt. Student loans. Credit cards. Mortgages. $315 trillion. Of obligation. Yet not a single plan. For repayment. Because repayment would collapse the system. If the US paid off its debt, dollars would evaporate from the economy. The money supply would shrink 60 to 70%. Trade would freeze. Banks would implode. Unemployment would explode. And the global financial heart would stop beating. So the machine must grow. Debt must rise. Permanently. The wealth only flows one direction. Who benefits? Not governments. Not workers. Not the public. But the institutions that own the debt. BlackRock. Vanguard. State Street. Fidelity. Global pension funds. Megabanks. Central banks. They hold the world's most profitable asset. Governments themselves. Every dollar of debt is an asset on their books. That pays interest forever. Taxpayers are the fuel. Debt is the mechanism. Interest is the harvest. It is the largest continuous wealth transfer in human history. And most people never see it. Because it isn't called a tax. It's called debt service. The trap is complete. No country can escape without imploding its own economy. No government can stop borrowing without collapsing the money supply. No citizen can vote the system away. Because even politicians must pay interest too. Every newborn enters the world already owing a share. And every crisis, from recessions to pandemics, feeds the machine even more. As long as we believe the system must survive, the architects win. The trap tightens. Interest grows. And the cycle continues. Now we return to the question that started this entire investigation. If every country is in debt, then who is the world paying? The simplest answer. We are paying the financial system itself. Not a king. Not a country. Not a single villain in a dark tower. We pay the architect's descendants. The modern institutions that inherited their system. A system that has become so vast, so essential, that it cannot collapse without taking civilization with it. In this world, debt is oxygen. The circle of illusion. Let's look at the US, the largest debtor on earth. $38 trillion in national debt. Who holds it? Pension funds. Insurance companies. Banks. The Federal Reserve. Trust funds like Social Security. Global investors. So when the U.S. government pays interest, roughly $1 trillion a year, it flows to banks who use your deposits, investment firms who use your retirement money, central banks that print money. It sounds like the government owes the people. But the truth is more predatory. The public owes the public's money to private managers, who charge rent for holding it. Money you worked for. Taxed away. Paid to creditors. Paid to wealthy shareholders. A perfect loop. You can't vote against it. You can't protest it. You can't stop it. Because the system doesn't need your permission. Why debt can never end. Imagine, just for a moment, that the U.S. paid off its debt. Those treasury bonds, sitting on balance sheets worldwide, would vanish. And the dollars created from those bonds would disappear too. The result? The money supply collapses. Markets crash. Banks fail. Retirement portfolios implode. The economy suffocates. Ending the debt would destroy the system it created. Debt is the foundation. Interest is the rent we pay to keep the illusion standing. A slow and silent transfer of power. History books describe governments as the most powerful institutions on earth. But in practice, governments are clients. Clients of BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, J.P. Morgan, Goldman Sachs, UBS, central banks. These entities manage pensions, mutual funds, insurance reserves, foreign investments, sovereign wealth funds. They don't run for office. They don't wave flags. They don't salute nations. Because their allegiance is to the machine that generates and controls debt. They are the landlords. Nations are the tenants. Citizens are the rent. The hidden rule of modern empire. In the old world, empires conquered land. In the new world, empires conquer debt. When Greece fell into crisis in 2010, who seized control? Not Rome. Not Turkey. Not a foreign army. The European Central Bank. And the IMF. Forced spending cuts. Reformed labor laws. Privatized national assets. Took control of the future of a sovereign nation. Without firing a shot. This is the new form of conquest. Control the debt, and you control the country. Control the dollar, and you control the world. And because the dollar is the global reserve currency, the U.S. Federal Reserve controls the pace of global economic breathing. A rate hike in Washington can collapse a bank in Brazil. Or a government in Kenya. Power so immense that even empires of the past could never dream of it. Why every crisis feeds the machine. Recessions. Wars. Pandemics. Every emergency ends the same way. Governments borrow more. After 2008, the U.S. added $10 trillion in new debt. After COVID-19, another $8 trillion. Crisis isn't a threat. Crisis is the business model. Debt spikes upward. Central banks expand balance sheets. Wall Street collects more interest. And the architects smile. The invisible cost, your future. When a child is born today in the United States, they enter life already owing over $100,000 in public debt obligations. And that number grows every second. They inherit a world where they must borrow for education, borrow for a home, borrow for healthcare, borrow for retirement. A life of loans. In a system of loans. But the most insidious truth. Debt shapes behavior. Debt controls choices. Debt restricts rebellion. A population in debt fears instability. More than corruption. They cling to the system that traps them. Because they cannot afford for it to fall. The cage keeps itself locked. The four architects, their legacy made clear. William Paterson. Debt becomes permanent. 1694. Nathan Rothschild. Debt becomes global. 1815. J.P. Morgan. Debt becomes infinite. 1913. Paul Volcker. Debt becomes inescapable. 1982. Together. They created the debt matrix. Not through conspiracy. But through incentives. They optimized a system where money must always flow upward. And where progress depends not on freedom, but on obligation. The final question. When people ask, how do we fix the debt? They reveal the greatest misunderstanding of all. Debt isn't a flaw. Debt is the blueprint. Debt isn't the crisis. Debt is the product. Debt isn't a chain. Debt is the architecture. And the architects designed it. So that, as long as nations exist, interest will be owed. Forever. The awakening. Now that you see the structure, even if it terrifies you, you've taken the essential first step. Because the most powerful part of any trap is the belief that no trap exists. You were never meant to question why debt never shrinks, why every crisis adds more debt, why taxes rise while services fall, why the wealthy grow wealthier without working a single extra hour. You were meant to simply keep paying. But the moment you understand that $38 trillion isn't a mistake, it's the system working as designed, you can never see the world the same again. The credits we're forced to pay. The hidden truth of global finance. We don't borrow money. We borrow the future. Our children and their children are the collateral for the machine's appetite. And the bill never stops coming. Closing message. If this story changed how you see debt, if you finally understand why escape feels impossible, then you have glimpsed the secret that shapes our era. We don't live in a world ruled by governments. We live in a world ruled by credit. And debt is the chains that bind us. The architects knew. As long as interest flows, power flows with it. And the people paying the rent will never own the house.